Lee Do-hyun freezes mid-step as he sees his eyes looking back at him from behind a dive bar counter. The flickering neon sign of the rusty anchor hummed with a low, electric buzz, mirroring the tension thrumming through Do-hyun's veins. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, a $1,000 fabric that felt more like a straitjacket than a garment of power. The scent of stale hops and cheap tobacco hitting him like a reminder of a life he wasn't allowed to have. Do-hyun scanned the dim room with the practiced, cold vigilance of a man who viewed every corner as a potential ambush point. In the back, a broken jukebox played a blues track that scratched at the air. A group of old men sat in a corner booth, laughing over half-empty pitchers, normal people enjoying a normal Tuesday, a simplicity Do-hyun had traded away for a syndicate throne 4 years ago. Then he saw her. The air in his lungs turned to lead. Standing behind the scarred mahogany bar, pulling a draft with a steady, practiced hand, was Aisha Monroe. She looked different, composed, settled, her quiet strength radiating a peace that made his own power look like a lie. She wasn't the broken girl he'd left in the middle of the night. She was a woman who had clearly moved on without him. But it was the small figure on the high stool beside the register that made Do-hyun's world tilt. A little girl, no older than 3, sat coloring with focused intensity. As the child looked up, her gaze caught the blue light of the neon sign, and Do-hyun's heart stopped. They were his eyes. Cold, piercing, and unmistakably Lee. The silent proof of the life he had abandoned was staring right back at him. Do-hyun chose a stool at the far end of the bar, a shadow among shadows, where the amber light of the back-shelf liquor bottles barely touched his face. He watched Aisha move. She was a master of the space, navigating the narrow gap between the taps and the well with a fluid, rhythmic grace that suggested she had done this 1,000 times. Every clink of glass against the rail, every snap of a beer cap, was a testament to the life she had built in the 4 years he had been a ghost. As the late-night crowd thinned, the roar of the jukebox faded into a low, mournful hum. Do-hyun stayed. He was the last patron, a silent sentinel in a $1,000 suit that felt increasingly like a costume. Aisha didn't look at him, not directly, but he felt the weight of her awareness. She wiped down the counter with methodical precision, moving closer until she was finally standing directly across from him. "We're closing," she said. Her voice was level, stripped of the warmth he remembered, the velvet tone that used to whisper his name in the quiet hours of the morning. It was the voice of a stranger. "One more," Do-hyun replied, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. "Please." Without a word, she reached for a clean glass. She didn't ask what he wanted. She simply poured a double of the cheapest rye on the shelf. The sharp, medicinal scent rose between them. She set the glass down on a fresh coaster, her movements crisp and professional. Her fingers never brushed his. "Aisha," he began, the name feeling heavy and sacred on his tongue. "I didn't think I'd find you here. I didn't think." "That's $10, she interrupted, her steady gaze meeting his for the first time. There was no fire in her eyes, no lingering resentment or hidden longing. There was only a cold, professional vacuum. It was worse than if she had screamed at him. It was as if the man who had vanished 4 years ago had truly died, and she was simply serving a ghost. Do-hyun pulled a crisp $100 bill from his wallet and slid it across the damp mahogany. "Keep it. I don't want your charity, Lee," she said, her voice dropping an octave, though her posture remained relaxed. She slid the bill back toward him with 2 fingers. $10. And then you leave. I have to get home to my daughter." The mention of his child, sent a fresh wave of vertigo through him. He wanted to ask her name, to ask how she was, to apologize for the years of silence. But the wall Aisha had built was impenetrable. She stood there, self-possessed and entirely complete without him, waiting for him to pay his debt and disappear back into the night. Do-hyun realized then that while he had been frozen in his regret, Aisha had outgrown him entirely. He laid a $10 bill on the bar, drained the burning rye in one swallow, and walked out into the cold, leaving his heart behind in the blue neon glow. Do-hyun returned the following evening, and the evening after that. He no longer wore the suffocating charcoal suit, opting instead for a dark cashmere sweater and slacks that allowed him to blend into the shadows of the corner booth. He became a fixture of the bar's periphery, a silent observer who arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon and stayed until the chairs were stacked on the tables. Aisha continued to treat him with the same surgical coldness, her professional mask never slipping. She served his rye without a word, her eyes never lingering on his for more than a second. But Do-hyun wasn't watching Aisha anymore. His focus had shifted to the small, circular table tucked away near the end of the bar, illuminated by a single, low-hanging pendant light. There sat Layla. She was a whirlwind of quiet concentration, surrounded by a scattered army of crayons and half-filled coloring books. Do-hyun watched her from his booth, his heart performing a slow, painful ache in his chest. She was beautiful, a perfect fusion of Aisha's soft features and his own sharp, angular bone structure. But it wasn't just her face that haunted him, it was the way she moved. As she deliberated between a cerulean and an indigo crayon, Layla paused. Her brow furrowed in a tiny mimicry of a scowl that Do-hyun saw in the mirror every morning. Then, her left hand came up to the table. With rhythmic, unconscious precision, her middle finger began to tap against the wood. Tap, 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 tap. Do-hyun froze, his own hand twitching involuntarily on the table in front of him. It was a nervous habit he had possessed since childhood, a rhythmic tick his father had tried to beat out of him and his grandmother had called the mark of the restless. To see it mirrored in this innocent child, born of a love he had discarded, was a revelation more profound than any blood test. He watched her for an hour, mesmerized by the silent proof of their connection. She tapped when she was deciding on a color. She tapped when she heard a loud laugh from the other end of the bar. She tapped when Aisha walked by and pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head. Every strike of her small finger against the table felt like a hammer blow to the walls Do-hyun had built around his life. He realized then that he wasn't just looking at his daughter. He was looking at the physical manifestation of his own stolen time. Layla was the living evidence of every birthday he'd missed, every milestone he wasn't there to witness, and every "I love you" he hadn't been able to say. She was the anchor he never knew he had, and as he watched her tap out the rhythm of his own soul, Do-hyun knew he could never walk away again. The Mafia boss was gone. Only a father remained, drowning in the blue neon silence. The sanctuary of the dive bar was shattered on a Tuesday night when the heavy front door swung open with a violence that didn't belong in Aisha's world. Do-hyun, positioned in his usual corner booth, felt the shift in the air before he even saw the men. 3 of them stepped into the blue neon glow, dressed in cheap leather jackets and wearing the practiced, vacant sneers of low-level street thugs. They didn't look like soldiers, they looked like hyenas. They bypassed the stools and went straight for the center of the bar. The leader, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, leaned heavily over the mahogany counter, encroaching on Aisha's personal space. Do-hyun's glass of rye paused halfway to his lips. His muscles coiled, a predatory instinct he had tried to suppress screaming back to life. Business looks slow, Aisha, the man sneered, his voice cutting through the low hum of the jukebox. A lot of dark corners in a place like this. Hard to see trouble coming until it's already breaking the furniture. Aisha didn't flinch. She continued to dry a glass, her movements steady, though Do-hyun noticed the slight tightening of her jaw. The rent is paid, Marcus. I don't owe you anything. The landlord gets the rent. We get the peace and quiet, Marcus replied, reaching out to lazily flick a bowl of pretzels off the counter. They shattered across the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the small room. New management in the neighborhood. Prices went up. 500 by Friday. Or we start taking it out of the inventory. Or maybe we start looking at that little girl who's always sitting in the back. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 40 degrees. At the mention of Layla, Aisha's composure finally cracked, not with fear, but with a desperate, protective heat. She reached for the phone beneath the bar, but Marcus's hand shot out, pinning her wrist to the wood. In the corner booth, Do-hyun stood up. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of a landslide. He was across the room before the other two thugs could even turn around. The powerful but destabilized man from the park was gone, replaced by the heir to a syndicate who had ordered deaths before breakfast. "Let go of her," Do-hyun said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a vibrating, lethal frequency that made the two lackeys jump. The leader turned, eyes scanning Do-hyun's expensive sweater and calm face. "This a friend of yours, Aisha? You should tell your boyfriend to mind his." Do-hyun didn't let him finish. He stepped into the light, his eyes meeting the thugs with a cold, vacuum-like intensity that usually preceded a funeral. For the first time, Aisha looked at Do-hyun not with professional distance, but with a flickering realization of the monster he could be. The shadow over the bar had grown, and it was draped in the silhouette of a father who had just found something worth killing for. Marcus scrambled out of the bar, his bravado leaking onto the floor along with the spilled pretzels, but the silence he left behind was heavier than his threats. Do-hyun didn't move for a long time, his eyes still fixed on the door as if he could set it ablaze with a look. Behind him, he heard the sharp, frantic intake of Aisha's breath as she rushed to the back to gather Layla into her arms. The next morning, the dive bar had a new set of regulars. Two black SUVs sat idling at opposite ends of the block, their windows tinted to an impenetrable obsidian. Men in dark, understated suits stood on the street corners, ostensibly checking their watches or scrolling through phones, but their eyes never left the entrance of the Rusty Anchor. To the neighborhood, it looked like a sudden influx of executive security. To Aisha, it looked like a cage. When the sun began to set, Do-hyun entered the bar. He expected a nod of gratitude, or perhaps a softening of the icy wall she had maintained. Instead, he found Aisha standing in the center of the room, her arms crossed, her eyes blazing with a fury he hadn't seen since the night he'd walked out on her. "Make them leave, Lee," she said, her voice trembling with a controlled rage. "They're here for your safety," Do-hyun replied, his tone calm, reasoned. "Marcus won't be the last one to try. The neighborhood is shifting, Aisha. You can't handle these people alone." "I have handled everything alone for 4 years," she snapped, stepping toward him until she was inches from his chest. "I raised our daughter alone. I built this business alone. I fought off every small-time shark in this zip code without a syndicate at my back. I am not a piece of territory for you to plant a flag on." "It's not territory," he argued, his hand reaching out instinctively before he pulled it back. "It's protection. It's a target," she corrected him, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than a scream. "Those men outside, they don't bring peace. They bring the world you said you were leaving behind. Layla doesn't need soldiers at the door. She needs a life where she isn't afraid of the men in suits. I won't have her growing up in the shadow of your blood-soaked protection." She pointed a steady finger toward the door. "If you want to help us, truly help us, then take your war somewhere else. We were fine before you walked in here, and we'll be fine after you go. Don't turn my sanctuary into a battlefield." Do-hyun looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the cost of his presence. He saw the way the color had drained from her face, not out of fear for Marcus, but out of fear of him. He realized then that his protection was just another form of possession. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the door, pulling his phone from his pocket to signal the withdrawal. He had come to save them, but he was only beginning to understand that the person they needed saving from most was the man he had spent his whole life becoming. The black SUVs were gone, but Do-hyun remained, a self-imposed exile at the far end of the bar. He had traded his army for a quiet, watchful presence that Aisha tolerated with a wary, tight-lipped silence. The air in the Rusty Anchor felt lighter without the suits at the door, but the chasm between the bar counter and Do-hyun's booth still felt like an unbridgeable sea. It happened during the slow lull of the late afternoon. Layla, bored with her crayons, had been chasing a rogue bouncy ball across the linoleum floor. In her toddler excitement, her foot caught the leg of a bar stool. She went down hard, the sound of her small body hitting the floor echoing sharply against the wood. Aisha was at the far end of the bar, trapped behind a delivery of heavy crates. Do-hyun, however, was already moving. He didn't think. He didn't calculate the optics of his power. He slid out of the booth and was on the floor beside the child before her first sob could break the silence. Layla's knee was scraped, a bright bloom of red surfacing on her dark skin. Her lower lip trembled, her eyes filling with the sudden, overwhelming shock of pain. Do-hyun felt a surge of panic more intense than any he had felt in a warehouse fire or a high-speed chase. His large, scarred hands that had been trained only to break and command, trembled as he reached for her. "Hey," he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, melodic frequency he didn't recognize as his own. "Hey, little one. You're okay. You're so brave." He scooped her up with a gentleness that seemed to defy his massive frame. Layla didn't recoil. Perhaps she recognized the rhythm of the man who had been watching her for weeks. Or perhaps she simply felt the desperate sincerity in his touch. She buried her face in the crook of his neck, her small hands clutching the soft cashmere of his sweater. Do-hyun sat on the floor with her, leaning his back against the cool mahogany of the bar. He rocked her slowly, murmuring nonsense words in Korean, lullabies his own mother had whispered before the syndicate took her. He felt the heat of her tears against his skin, the rhythmic hitch of her breath slowing as she began to calm. In that moment, the Mafia boss ceased to exist. There was no turf war, no family legacy, no blood-soaked protection. There was only the weight of a child who shared his blood, trusting him to keep the world at bay. It was a different kind of power, one that didn't require fear to sustain it. Aisha appeared above them, her face pale, her hands trembling as she held a first aid kit. She stopped, frozen by the sight of the most dangerous man she knew sitting in the dirt, cradling their daughter like she was the only thing in the universe that mattered. For the first time, the icy wall in her eyes didn't just crack, it began to melt. She saw not the ghost of her past, but the father of her child, finally understanding that true strength wasn't in the ability to strike, but in the will to heal. The fragile peace inside the bar was shattered 48 hours later by a reality Do-hyun had tried to pray away. While he had been learning the rhythm of a father's pulse, his enemies had been measuring the depth of his distraction. In the high-rise offices of the city, a rival boss, a man named Kong who had long coveted Do-hyun's shipping routes, had seen the surveillance photos. He didn't see a father seeking redemption. He saw a high-ranking kingpin who had finally grown a heart, and therefore a target. It was the hour between the afternoon lull and the evening rush, the time when the bar was most vulnerable. Aisha was in the back office, and Layla was at her small table, humming as she practiced the finger-tapping habit she had inherited from a man she didn't yet know was her protector. Do-hyun stood at the end of the bar, eyes fixed on the street, his internal radar screaming of a storm he had brought to their doorstep. The black sedan didn't idle like Do-hyun's men had. It screeched to a halt, tires smoking against the curb. 4 men stepped out, their movements devoid of the subtlety of debt collectors. They carried the heavy, purposeful gait of professional hitters. They weren't coming for protection money. They were coming to burn Do-hyun's world to the ground to see if he would crawl through the ashes. "Aisha, get Layla to the cold room. Now." Do-hyun's voice cracked through the bar like a whip, shedding every ounce of the softness he'd found on the floor with his daughter. Aisha appeared in the doorway, eyes wide with the sudden, terrifying realization that her warnings had come true. She didn't argue. She saw the look in Do-hyun's eyes, the return of the monster, and scooped Layla up, disappearing into the heavy-duty steel walk-in behind the bar just as the first brick shattered the front window. Glass rained down in a glittering, lethal shower. Do-hyun didn't flinch. He kicked the heavy mahogany bar table over, creating a barricade as the front door was kicked off its hinges. Kang's message arrived in the form of lead and fire. The twisted reality of his life had finally caught up to the sanctuary he'd tried to build. As the first muzzle flash lit up the dim blue neon of the bar, Do-hyun realized the horrifying truth. To save the family he had just found, he would have to become the very thing Aisha feared most. He reached into the small of his back, drawing the cold steel of his past, his face a mask of lethal, focused sorrow. The war had arrived, and it was no longer about territory, it was about survival. The air inside the bar disintegrated into a roar of gunfire and shattering glass. Do-hyun moved with a cold, lethal efficiency that had been honed in the darkest corners of Seoul, but his eyes never left the steel door of the walk-in cooler where Aisha and Layla were hidden. He wasn't fighting for territory anymore. He was fighting for the only light he had ever truly known. Through the haze of smoke and neon, he saw one of Kang's men move toward the bar's center. The hitter wasn't aiming at Do-hyun. He was aiming at the thin plywood wall that separated the main room from the hallway leading to the cooler. It was a blind shot, a spray of lead intended to terrorize or kill whatever was hiding behind it. Do-hyun didn't hesitate. He abandoned his cover, his boots crunching over broken glass as he threw himself into the line of fire. The impact was a dull, hot thud against his shoulder, spinning him around. The world went white for a second, the metallic scent of his own blood mixing with the cordite, but he stayed on his feet until the last of the shooters was neutralized and the street outside echoed with the screech of retreating tires. Silence returned to the rusty anchor, heavy and suffocating. Do-hyun slumped against the bar, his hand clutching his shoulder as a dark stain bloomed across his sweater. The heavy steel door creaked open. Aisha stepped out, her face a mask of terror that slowly shifted into agonizing realization as she saw the wreckage and the man bleeding out in the center of it. Layla, Do-hyun rasped, his voice a ghost of itself. Is she? She's okay. She's safe, Aisha whispered, rushing toward him. She didn't stay back this time. She didn't look at him with the coldness of a stranger. She knelt in the glass and blood, her hands trembling as she forced him to sit back. Lee, look at me. Stay with me. She pulled a clean bar towel from the shelf, pressing it hard against his wound. Do-hyun winced, his breath hitching, but he didn't pull away. For the first time in 4 years, the silence between them wasn't a weapon, it was a bridge. You stayed, she said softly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears as she worked to stem the flow. You didn't run. You stood in front of it. I spent my whole life standing in front of the wrong things, he managed to say, his gaze locking onto hers. I wasn't going to let them take the only thing that matters. Aisha didn't answer with words. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his for a fleeting, desperate moment. In the wreckage of the bar, amidst the smell of gunpowder and rye, the ice finally shattered. She wasn't just tending to a wound. She was acknowledging the man who had bled for them, finally seeing the father beneath the monster. Do-hyun did not go to the hospital. Instead, he allowed a trusted underground medic to stitch the wound in the back of the bar, while Aisha watched with a silent, heavy intensity. By dawn, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. He knew that as long as he wore the ring of the Lee Syndicate, the bar would always be a target and Layla would always be a bargaining chip. He arrived at the family estate, while the morning mist still clung to the traditional tiled roofs. In the grand hall, the 5 elders of the council sat in a semicircle, their faces like carved stone. At the center sat his grandmother, the true architect of his life, her eyes sharp enough to see the ghost of the bullet wound beneath his linen shirt. You look haggard, Do-hyun, she said, her voice a fragile rasp that commanded absolute silence. We heard of the skirmish at the tavern. A mess. We will deal with Kang's insolence by the week's end. There will be no retaliation, Do-hyun said, his voice echoing against the high cedar beams. He stepped forward, the movement pulling at his stitches, and knelt in the center of the room. He didn't bow out of submission, he bowed out of transition. I am here to return what was never truly mine. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the signet ring, the heavy gold band that represented 4 generations of blood and iron. He placed it on the polished floor. Beside it, he laid a thick folder containing the deeds to his penthouse, the keys to his fleet, and the signed transfers of his offshore holdings. The room went cold. You would throw away a kingdom for a barmaid and a half-blood child? An elder hissed, his face contorting in disgust. I am not throwing it away, Do-hyun replied, looking his grandmother directly in the eye. I am buying their peace. My life for theirs. Take the assets. Take the name. Tell the world Lee Do-hyun died in that bar last night. If even a shadow of the syndicate crosses that threshold again, I will burn the accounts I haven't turned over and testify until there is nothing left of this family but ash. It was the ultimate gamble, a declaration of war used to secure a treaty of surrender. His grandmother looked at the ring, then at the grandson she had raised to be a wolf. She saw the same tap-tap-tap of his finger against his thigh, the restless rhythm of a man who had finally found a place to rest. You will leave with nothing, she warned. I leave with everything, he countered. The transition was silent. No papers were signed. In their world, a word given in the Hall of Elders was a blood contract. As Do-hyun walked out of the estate for the last time, the weight that had pressed on his shoulders since childhood vanished. He was a man with no title, no money, and a healing hole in his shoulder. But for the first time in 35 years, he was a man who belonged to himself. He headed back toward the blue neon light, ready to start a life where the only thing he had to command was the respect of the woman he loved. The blue neon sign of the Rusty Anchor had been replaced by a warm, hand-painted wooden board that read Monroe and Dew's Family Tavern. The flickering, electric hum of the past was gone, replaced by the soft, golden glow of Edison bulbs and the rich aroma of ginger, garlic, and slow-simmered brisket. The dive bar had shed its layer of grime and secrets, transforming into a space where the shadows no longer had anything to hide. Do-hyun moved behind the bar with a different kind of precision than he had used in his previous life. He wasn't wielding power or cold steel. He was wielding a cocktail shaker and a smile that reached his eyes. He wore a simple denim apron over a rolled-up white shirt, the scars on his arms no longer hidden, but accepted as part of the terrain of his journey. He reached for a glass, and though his shoulders still twinged occasionally when the weather turned cold, he felt stronger than he ever had in the halls of the Lee estate. Across the pass-through window to the kitchen, Aisha caught his eye. She was plating a fusion of Korean sliders and soul food sides, her movements as fluid and self-possessed as ever. She wasn't just settled, she was thriving. When she looked at him, there was no longer a wall or a vacuum. There was a shared history and a hard-won peace. She winked at him, a silent, I love you, that didn't need a single carat of diamond to prove its worth. In the quiet booth at the end of the bar, the same one Do-hyun had occupied as a ghost, Layla was busy with a fresh set of markers. She was 4 now, taller and more inquisitive, her laughter a frequent and melodic interruption to the tavern's chatter. As she concentrated on a drawing of the 3 of them standing in front of the tavern, her left hand came up to the table. Tap, 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 tap. Do-hyun paused in the middle of pouring a craft beer, his heart swelling as he watched her. He walked over to her table, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. Layla looked up, her piercing Korean eyes crinkling with joy. Look, Daddy, she whispered, pointing to the drawing. I put the blue light in the window so the ghosts can find their way home. They already did, Layla, Do-hyun replied, his voice thick with a quiet, overwhelming gratitude. He looked around the room, at the family sharing platters, the couples laughing over drinks, and the woman who had given him a second chance at being human. He wasn't a king, and he wasn't a monster. He was a partner, a father, and the tavern's most permanent regular. As the sun set outside, painting the street in shades of gold, Do-hyun finally knew what it felt like to live a normal life, and he wouldn't trade it for all the kingdoms in the world.